Good evening, everybody. I hope you had a great day. I know it got chilly, but it was a beautiful day. Love to see the sunshine. I can't complain about weather like that. And what was even better today was the warmth of the hospitality that I got to experience. You know, that started yesterday and has continued through today. It has been a joy getting the opportunity to visit with so many of you. That's just one of the benefits of gospel meetings, is getting to connect with Christians in other places that are trying to serve the Lord in their neck of the woods, and encourage each other as you share what you're doing in your place. So thank you for the work that you're doing for God and his kingdom here. And I hope the next couple of nights will be just as encouraging to you as what I've heard from yesterday. As always, if you hear something that you have a question about, anything at all, please feel free to talk to me about that afterwards. And several of you have. You've had questions about some of the things that I've shared or just some of the experiences that I've had, and I'm very grateful for your comfort in asking about that. We're going to continue our series talking about the life of Moses, and we're going to skip so much. You know, we talked about his birth yesterday morning, and then we talked about his rejection at 40 years old. So finishing out chapter 2, when Moses thought that it was time for him to identify with his people, and the Israelites rejected him. And because of how that all turned out, he actually fled. He fled for his life and went to the land of Midian. And he had no idea how his life was going to turn out. He had no idea that it was going to be another 40 years. But he went to the land of Midian, and at 80 years old was called to go back. I mean, part of what we're going to skip over tonight, we're not going to have a whole lot of time to talk about the burning bush. And we're not going to have a whole lot of time to talk about the 10 plagues. I know you all are super familiar with that, and we usually teach that when we're teaching our children in our curriculum as they go through their cycles of the Bible. We'll refer to some of those. We're just not going to go into as much detail with that. Where we're going to wind up this evening is in Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16 follows after the deliverance God provides through the Red Sea. So the Egyptians have experienced the full might of the 10 plagues over a course of quite a bit of time. And they experienced the worst of them, which was the loss, the death of their firstborn. And there are so many of those plagues that I wish I could have been a spectator of, and I'm really glad that I wasn't a spectator of. You know, for example, you know, some of the plagues, God was trying to help people understand that his people were special. So some of the plagues afflicted the Egyptians, but the Israelites were spared. So I've always wondered what it would look like to have a satellite image of Egypt when the plague of darkness came through and the lights were on in Goshen. Like, what would that have looked like from God's perspective? There's light with his people. Like, that visual just kind of stands out to me in my imagination. I have no idea what it actually looked like, but I kind of picture that, right? I wish I could have seen that from space, not to have lived through it, because the darkness was so dark it could be felt. And imagine the horror of that. And I wish I could have experienced the Passover from the Israelites' perspective, but I really don't want to have ever experienced that from the Egyptians' perspective. And even from the Israelites' perspective, that would have been horrible. Because you haven't lived through the Passover yet. You don't know what it's going to be like. By faith, you're doing what God has called you to do, which seems really odd, to eat this hastily prepared meal and smearing blood on your door. Like, that seems kind of weird. And then in the middle of the night, you realize that the Egyptian neighbors are wailing out of panic and loss because the firstborn male in their family, they're all dying. And I don't know at what age that dying stopped. Like, so for our family, that would have been my dad, me, and my oldest son. Boom, boom, boom. One night. I really don't want to experience that. But because of that loss, finally, after everything else they've experienced, Pharaoh is broken. And he sends the Israelites out. And they're throwing things at them. They plunder Egypt, is what the text says. They go out of captivity rich. And something really interesting takes place that Moses refers to later in the book of Deuteronomy, where he tries to get the Israelites to maintain their perspective of what an awesome thing God did for them. You know, they went into Egypt a family of 70 people, and they came out a nation. And Moses' questioning in the early chapters of Deuteronomy is, what nation in the history of the world came into being this way? And the answer is none. They had a shared delivery experience. Eventually they go to Mount Sinai, and we'll talk about that, Lord willing, tomorrow night. You know, they end up with a law. They go into the wilderness, and they come out of the wilderness, and they're this galvanized people with a shared history, a shared deliverance, a shared law, a shared way to worship. Like, no nation has ever sprung onto the world stage that way. So they have just experienced this deliverance through the Red Sea. They've just sung this incredible song of thanksgiving. And then you get to chapter 16. And what I'd like to do is to spend some time talking through chapter 16. Let's start in verse 1. And since I'm over 40, that means I put my glasses on. They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." And there's a fascinating thing about the word grumble, like it's used more than 7 times through this chapter. And it's a special kind of word. We have certain words in English that kind of represent this, but it's a word that, as you say it, it kind of mimics the sound that it's trying to communicate. In our older English versions, we actually have the word murmur, which is a little bit closer. Because when you say the word, if we had everyone in this room at the same time in a low tone go, it sounds like a bunch of people grumbling. And we have several words that do that. This is one of them. And we should be shocked. We're supposed to be shocked. They have just escaped all of those plagues. They've just escaped through the Red Sea in a miraculous way. They've just praised God for how good he is. And the very next chapter, so ungrateful. And before I get too hard on them, can I just say, they are us. Because we do the same thing. We have really short attention spans, and we forget the goodness of God. And it's really easy for us to just kind of blaze past the amazing ways that God's providence has blessed us in our lives and focus on the difficulty of the moment that we're in and complain. But in verse 3, what it highlights, the ridiculousness of it, they were just delivered from slavery, where their people were oppressed, and when Moses was born, they were legally killing the boys. But what they're worried about is their stomachs. You'd think they were a bunch of teenagers saying the fridge was empty. And they exaggerate. Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. Like, all they ever did all day long was eat. And that is not what their life was like. Now, granted, getting food for them in Egypt was easier than it was in the wilderness up to this point. I'll grant them that. But getting food was not this easy, and it's not all they did. And then they blame Moses. You have brought us out. No, Jehovah brought you out. So verse 4, the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven for you. And the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. And on the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. I just want to stop there for a second. Can we just highlight how merciful God is? God had every right to say, you bunch of ungrateful, whiny brats. Like, he could have said that, and it would have been justified. But he didn't. Instead, in his mercy and his grace, he says, look, I'm about to do something, and I'm going to continue to shower my grace and favor on them, and it's going to be in such a way that it's going to test something about them, right? So as we work through 16, what we've seen is this, the people grumbling and God providing a test. God is providing a test. And can I just offer a suggestion about the test that God is providing here? Who is the test for? God's omniscient. He already knows how this is going to go. Can I suggest that this test is not for God? This test is for the people. This test is for the people to learn something about themselves. Right? Have you ever thought about that? Sometimes you're going through something hard, and maybe it's God trying to provide an opportunity for you to learn something about yourself. What I understand is there's some people going through tests right now, academic tests, right? Part of that isn't just to show other people what you know. Part of that is for you to figure out what you know and what you don't. And there are some tests that God allows us to go through so that we will learn something about ourselves. And sometimes we don't like what we learn. But it's redemptive, because if we see something that isn't what it ought to be, then we have the opportunity to change it. But we can't change it if we don't know first. And so God, I think, in his mercy, is providing a test for them to learn something about themselves. So in verse 6, Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, at evening you shall know. You shall know. God already knows stuff. You shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. It was not Moses. They need to be reminded already that it was God. In verse 7, in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. For what are we that you grumble against us? And Moses said, when the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, that you have grumbled against him, what are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, say to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. You see all this grumbling? Time and time and time again, this emphasis on their grumbling. Verse 10, as soon as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. They see some kind of visible manifestation of God, a brightness. And the Lord said to Moses in verse 11, I've heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. In the evening, quail came up and covered the camp, and in the morning dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. And when the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it's the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. And this is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it, each one of you, as much as he can eat. You shall each take an omer, according to the number of the persons that each of you has in his tent. And the people of Israel did so. And they gathered, some more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. Let's catch up on some of the points here. This is a miraculous feeding. You know, I have camped. I've slept in tents. I've slept in a hammock. I've slept on a concrete floor. I've woken up with with mist and dew on the ground, and I have never seen bread materialize in the dirt. Ever. That's not the way physics works. God is miraculously providing in the wilderness for all of these people, where they wake up in the morning and breakfast is right there. All they have to do is step out and gather it and eat it. That's all they have to do. And it wasn't just like we're rationing out bread and water here. We're giving you the bare minimum. The quantity satisfied everyone, whether they ate a little or whether they ate a lot. You were satisfied. You were full when you were done. Not only that, he provided the quail. So it wasn't just bread. They also had protein. They had meat. But there were some specific instructions. In verse 19, Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over till the morning." So he's saying every day you gather what you need. Don't save any. There are no leftovers. Don't put it in the fridge. Don't put it in the box. Like, eat what you want, and then tomorrow morning get more. Verse 20, but they did not listen. And that should be highlighted all the way through. It's emphasized again later on. They did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till the morning, and it bred worms and stank, and Moses was angry with them. God has just provided a miraculous meal that's feeding all of these people, and the one thing that he says do not do is don't save any, because there will be more. And I want to be compassionate here. I don't want to go into too much detail or share something that I shouldn't share, but can I just offer some perspective? If you have somebody who in some way or another through the course of their life have been taken advantage of or hurt or manipulated by withholding food, it does things to them. It just does. I know people who have developed some really bad habits with food, and part of that is because they developed skills and habits in order to survive what was being done to them. My grandmother lived through the Great Depression. She had 2 freezers in her garage. She saved food in plastic bread bags. And her gift to us growing up, because as we were growing up, I was the oldest of 6, all within the age range of 7 years apart, they gave us food. That was their way of saying, "I love you." Every time we showed up at their house, there was a full, brand new apple cake. They would butcher cows for us and send us home with hamburger, a lot of hamburger. Because they grew up, my grandparents grew up without. And they did not gorge. When they ate, they didn't gorge. But they never threw anything away. They always had a garden so that they could guarantee they had fresh vegetables. Right? And there are people that are hurt with food in a much worse way than that. That was a whole generational thing. But there are some people who are abused with food, and it does weird stuff. They will hoard food. They'll hide food. They'll stockpile food. They'll eat a lot all at once because they don't know if they'll get another meal, so they're just going to eat right now. Right? It does weird stuff to you. Now, it doesn't have to stay that way. You can learn new habits, but it takes time. And so you've got these people where food was obviously a thing. It was a thing, and God was compassionate toward that. But there's this fascinating thing that I don't think we have as much appreciation for. Frederick Douglass, from several generations ago, as he was fighting for the rights of slaves in the U.S., because he himself had been one when he was born, and then he fled to the North and he was freed. But one of the things that he communicated really well in his biography was this idea of a slavery mindset. That you can take the slave from his slavery and give him freedom, but if he grew up under that, it does something to you. And you see things differently. And it's hard to free your mind from it. And I think we need to look at that first generation of Israelites that way. There was stuff that they learned and experienced that they took on in order to survive, and they had a hard time shaking it. And I think that's part of what's going on here. Now, one of the things to say about that is it should help us be more compassionate. It doesn't change the fact that God gave instruction and God expects them by faith to do it. But it's harder for them to do it. Does that make sense? For example, and I know I might be chasing a rabbit trail, but I think it's pertinent to what's going on here. Right? Faith and trust is required for everybody that would want to please God. Hebrews 11 emphasizes that. You have to have faith. There are no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I mean, you want to please God, you have to trust him. You have to believe that he exists and is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. But trusting is harder for some people than others. Trust for some people is more costly because what they may have gone through in life makes them suspicious, and they have a hard time trusting. That it requires some humility and surrender on your part to trust. Now, it doesn't remove the requirement, the essential requirement to trust, but it's harder for some people than others. Look, I am blessed. I grew up in a family. My parents were only ever married to each other. My parents always provided for us. We didn't always have a lot, but we had enough. Then you take some kid that never had enough, and he was bounced all over the place, and adults in his life were not reliable. Trust for him is harder than it is for me, and I've got to be compassionate about that. The requirement is the same, but the cost is different. Does that make sense? And so you come back to these Israelites, and you look at them, and it's really easy to be critical. Like, God gave you one thing: don't save the food. But that one thing was hard. They learned to do it eventually, but initially they struggled. And because they struggled, their houses or their tents ended up smelling like a freshman guy's dorm. You had rot going on and worms in the stuff. After one day, there were no preservatives in the manna. That's a joke. Okay. I've said some really heavy things. We're lightening it up for a second. The manna started going bad, and Moses was angry. So they learned, verse 21, morning by morning they gathered it, each as much as he could eat, but when the sun grew hot, it melted. So they left it was just gone. And on the sixth day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each, and when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake, and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning." So they laid it aside till the morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." And on the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather. They're like, is he joking? Like, this doesn't make sense. God says not to save it because it'll be gone in about 12, 16 hours. But there's something weird about it that on this day it'll last for 36. That doesn't make any sense. I think we're going to wake up and it's going to be moldy and rotty and gross again. We better go out to the field. Because it was miraculous. The only thing that preserved it was God. Nothing changed in the manna. God was preserving the bread an extra day. So as we continue making our points, the quantity satisfied, they did not listen. And Moses' response, the Lord's response in verse 28, after the people went out on the Sabbath day to hunt some more, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my law? The Lord has given you this day of rest, so observe this day of rest. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the seventh day." And then after all of that, it starts to get into the physical description of the manna. Verse 31, the house of Israel called its name manna, which literally means, what is it? Greatest focus group naming process ever. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. That sounds pretty good. And so Moses gives some final instruction regarding all of that. And then Moses in verse 33 tells Aaron to take up a jar and save some of it, and it's supposed to be kept as a reminder before the generations of Israel. And so this manna that gets nasty after a day, the bit that was saved is preserved for a really long time. Again, miraculous. And what the Israelites wrestled with in this chapter, all the way through, is they were focused on the gift, not the giver. They were focused on how full they felt or how empty they felt. And it's so easy to slip into this, I focus on the gift and I forget about the giver. It's so easy to do. You know, there's a reason that it's appropriate to send thank you cards. You know, we have these events in our lives, usually around graduations or the birth of children or weddings or things like that, where you receive gifts from a lot of people at once. And it's appropriate to send the card, because what the card is communicating, whether you mean to or not, what the card is communicating when it shows up in the mailbox of the person that gave you the gift is you're thanking the individual and acknowledging the giver of the gift. And so it's a pretty good idea to do that promptly and not wait like 4, 5, 6, 7 months down the road, which can happen, I get. But the more prompt you are, the more it communicates that I'm grateful for the giver, whatever the gift may have been, and even if it's the 4th toaster. When you get married, you'll know what I'm talking about. Now, finally, I think we got to drop there in the slide. There's one more point to be made about the manna in Exodus 16, and it was a gift that promoted life. They needed food in order to survive. And so God provided what they needed for survival. He knew they're not putting down roots, they're not planting gardens, they're not building houses. This is a really, really, really long car ride. And I've got to provide. And so he provides so that they will survive. The gift promoted life. Now, as we've been doing through these lessons, we end up going over to Deuteronomy 18:15, where Moses promised, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers, and it is to him you shall listen, which means there's a corresponding event to this in the life of Jesus. And there is. Brian talked about it on Sunday. And it's over in John chapter 6. Turn over to John chapter 6. In the beginning of the chapter, you have a miraculous feeding of 5,000 people. Starting in verse 1, after this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. So they're seeing miracles being performed by Jesus. And remember the point that we made yesterday. For generations, the Israelites have been looking for the next Moses. Who's the next Moses? Moses said someone would show up and be like him. And they're thinking about Moses all wrong, the future Moses. Because they're looking at, just like our forefathers were oppressed by the Egyptians, we are currently oppressed by the Romans. Who's going to deliver us? This guy is going to deliver us and free us from this oppression. But that's not what Jesus came to free them from. So they see Jesus performing miracles and they're swarming him because they see miraculous things going on and that they point to something. In verse 3, Jesus went up on the mountain and there he sat down with his disciples. He's starting to teach. And what you've got going on is you've got a group of people that are curious. In Exodus 16, you had a bunch of people grumbling, but at the beginning of John chapter 6, you've got a bunch of people that are curious. What is going on with this guy? Now in verse 4, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. And lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? And he said this to test him. Just like God was testing the Israelites, Jesus is testing his disciples. He already knows what he's going to do, but he wants them to figure out some things about him and about themselves. Verse 6, he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. And Philip answered him, 200 denarii would not be enough for bread for each of them to get a little. Like, that's a lot of bread. But that bread is not going to take care of this massive crowd. And when you read about these miracles and these numbers, similar to Acts chapter 2, and it talks about that day 3,000 souls were added, a lot of times those counts just were the men. And so the odds are high that it's easily double, maybe triple that number when you add in women and kids. And so Philip wasn't joking. Like, if we were to go down to a bakery in town and get all the bread that they have, it would not feed all these people. So Jesus provides a test. Let's come down to verse 8. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish." I'm sure all the disciples were like, and? Like, he just said 200 denarii wouldn't cut it, and you're telling me this little kid has his sack lunch? What good is that? And that's kind of his point. What are they for so many? Like, this kid has something, but that's not going to do the job. And so in verse 10, Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. You see, the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. And then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, and also the fish, as much as they wanted. Sound similar? In verse 12, when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." And so they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. And when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet Moses." This is the second Moses who has come into the world. In verse 15, perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Let's catch up on our points. So the people were curious, and Jesus provided a test, and then there's a miraculous feeding. And I want to emphasize, it was miraculous. You'll read some commentaries written by some pretty secular people, and they're like, it was not a miracle, like nothing really changed. If there was a miracle, it was a miracle of generosity. When they saw that little boy share his humble little sack lunch, they were all convicted deep, deep down in their gut, and they're like, well, I'll share my sack lunch, and I'll share my sack lunch, and everyone shares their sack lunch with the people who didn't have sack lunches, and so Jesus got people to give. That's not what happened. That is not what the text says. The disciples are saying there is no food. We don't have enough money. Even if we had enough money, it would not take care of this large crowd. It was a miracle. It was a miracle of multiplication, and I wish I could have been there to see that. It's like the never-ending basket. He just goes down, and you never see the number of fish go down. And you never see the loaf of bread run out. It just keeps going. So much so that, similar to Exodus 16, no matter how much you ate, as long as you got your fill, and there were still 12 baskets left over. It was a miracle. And similarly, when you get down to verse 14 and 15, as the people reach a conclusion about Jesus, they reached a right conclusion. He was the prophet. He was the prophet they were looking for. But all through his ministry, how many times did he even tell the closest disciples, "My time has not yet come. My time has not yet come. My time has not yet come." And even though people around him had heard him say that, he knew this crowd was about to force him into being a king because they weren't listening. They weren't listening. And as was pointed out on Sunday, you come down to verse 22, the boat leaves, the disciples leave, and they know Jesus didn't get on the boat, But then Jesus was gone the next day, and they're trying to figure out where he went. So in verse 22, on the next day, the crowd that remained on the other side of the sea saw that there had been only one boat there, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but that his disciples had gone away alone. Other boats from Tiberias came near the place where they had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. They're connecting it to the previous day's miracle. Verse 24, so when the crowd saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they themselves got into the boats and went to Capernaum seeking Jesus. I mean, imagine all these people flooding the little town of Capernaum. Where's Jesus? Where's Jesus? Where's the guy? Man, that was a great feast yesterday. And when they found him on the other side in verse 25, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? And Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. You're here for the wrong reason. The reason that you're here is because you got a big old meal that filled you up and you didn't have to pay for it. And you want it to happen again. Now, we have a story in our family about my dad. He's just very honest about this. My father grew up Catholic. Right, went to a Catholic school. He was an altar boy. When he was in middle school, he started to question the Catholic faith. Stopped going anywhere. And then in high school, met and started dating my mom. But he didn't become a Christian until after they were married and after I was born. But in high school, he and his buddies would go to church on Sunday. And the way they decided where to go to church is they would cold call the church and say, hey, what are you guys putting on for lunch on Sunday? And they'd pick the church that was putting on the best spread, they thought, and they would go to that church for Sunday morning and then eat the free food and then go home. Because they were teenage boys that really didn't believe in God. You ask them, why did you go? For the food. They just went for the food. And they went all over town. That's what these people are doing. They recognize something about Jesus, but Jesus just calls them out and says, you guys are here. And you know what's going on? They are focused on the gift. They're focused on the gift, the food, but they're not paying attention to the spiritual nature of the gift of Jesus and the giver who is God. And so Jesus starts to get on them about all of that. I mean, this is the text, and it was so helpful when Brian went through this on Sunday, is Jesus starts to explain, I am the bread of life. I'm the bread that has come down from heaven. And he says some things that really challenge them. They think he's talking about cannibalism, and he just doubles down on it. And I love that about Jesus. He just doubles down on that. Come down to verse 48. I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. And then the Jews started disputing among themselves. And I really wish I was there for that. You've got this good Jewish boy, son of a carpenter, and it sounds like cannibalism. And they're just freaking out. Because 30 minutes ago, they were going to make him king, and now he's advocating cannibalism, and he's not. What he's saying is you have to partake of me. You have to belong to me. He's not being literal, but they don't get it. And even his disciples struggled with it down in verse 60. Many of the disciples heard it, and they said, this is a hard saying. We don't quite get it. But Jesus, knowing in himself that his disciples were grumbling, murmuring about this, said to them, do you take offense at this? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? Like, if you're getting freaked out at this, what if you saw me go back to where I came from? Hint, hint, Acts 1. Jesus, and this is not going to show up, Jesus is the gift that provided eternal life. What he ends up saying in verse 35, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. I think that's a pretty amazing connection between Exodus 16 and John 6. where Moses foreshadows Jesus. And what lessons can we learn from all of this? And I think there are at least 5. I'm sure there are more, and if you think of them, please share them with me. The first thing is that God provides tests for us to learn things about ourselves. We made that point as we went, that God was testing the Israelites so that they would figure some things out. Jesus was testing his disciples so that they would figure some things out. God already knows what we're going to choose, but he's trying to help us figure it out. So think about that. God provides what we need for life. He provides what we need for living life here, and he has provided abundantly for us spiritually. And we need to make sure that we never overlook the giver of a gift. Don't get so focused on the gift that you forget God, who's the giver of every good gift. And something that the Israelites struggle with, and I think we struggle with it too, physical provision is good. Spiritual provision is best. I'm so grateful that God has blessed us so richly here in the U.S. I'm so grateful for that. I've been in countries where people struggled more, and they did with a whole lot less. And in some cases, I think they're more content and happy than we are. But God has provided for them. But no matter how much you have or how much you don't, his provision in Jesus is best. And we need to remember that. And just like Moses was trying to get the Israelites to figure out in Exodus 16, and just like Jesus was trying to get the disciples to figure out in John 6, when Jesus talks, we need to listen. And there are times where he's going to say some things, and you're just like, did he really mean that? Did he really call me to that? Did he ask me to give that up? Is he asking me to step out this way? There are some times you're going to struggle, and that's okay. And it's okay to say, like the disciples did, that's hard. The disciples did it over in Matthew chapter 19 when Jesus was talking about divorce, and they're like, oh man, Jesus, what you just taught, that's hard. And he's like, yeah, I know. And there are some things that Paul wrote that were hard to understand. I know. And that's okay to admit, but eventually, since Jesus is the one talking, even when I don't quite understand by faith, I need to listen. Maybe that has to do with conversion, where you've heard so many different things about conversion. And at the end of the day, we just need to do what the gospel calls us to do. I need to believe that Jesus is who he claims to be, the Son of God who died for me. And I need to confess that I'm a sinner in need of him doing that. And in faith, I need to step forward and be baptized into the body of Christ. I need to be united with him in his death. I need to die to sin and self. I need to live faithfully as I follow him as a disciple for the rest of my life. Maybe that's the first time you've heard that. We can talk about that some more. But when Jesus talks, we need to listen. Whatever your need is, whatever you're struggling with, I hope this was a helpful lesson. And if there's some way that we can serve you, we can't do that unless you let us know. And I'm confident that the elders here and the evangelists here would be honored to help you however they can in your spiritual life. Why don't you let us know what we can do for you as you come to the front as we stand and as we sing.